Hello everyone and welcome back to Musings with Musa. It's the 27th of May as I'm filming this. It's a beautiful day outside in Lahore. So I woke up, a little early today. I woke up around 6. I had some food, I had some coffee, I got some work done, and now I'm here with you guys to discuss the books which I've been reading this month. And if you guys like these kinds of videos, do let me know. I might just turn this into a series. So I got through 6 really interesting books this month, some of which I really enjoyed, some of them not as much, but I think they're all deserving of at least a mini review. So I think that's what we'll do in today's video. Before I get into each of the reviews, let me just list down the 6 books that I've read or I'm reading, because the last of these I'm still getting through. So the first book was The Peregrine by J.A. Baker. This was followed up by the Presocratics Reader by Patricia Curd. After this was Stamped from the Beginning by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. After that was Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. Following this was The Last Days of Socrates by Plato. And last but not the least, the book which I'm currently reading and really enjoying is Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. Alright, so the first book on our list is The Peregrine by J.A. Baker. Now this was a book which, when I was getting into it, I didn't really know what to expect, and the reason for that is because The Peregrine falls into a category of writing which I don't think I've ever experienced before, and that's nature writing. Now before I get into what makes this book so good, I think I should tell you a bit about the story behind this. So from 1954 to 1963, J.A. Baker spent these 10 years of his life observing these peregrine falcons in the Essex County of England. And then he spent the next 2 to 3 years taking the hundreds and hundreds of journal entries that he had gathered and condensing them into a single 200-page book. The first thing which makes this book so interesting, aside from the story, is how good the prose is. Often while reading the book, it reminded me of the works of Hemingway, the way that he describes nature in works like For Whom the Bell Tolls. It was also poetic to the point where it reminded me of the works of some of the British Romantic poets. Baker, even though he was just a regular guy, he wasn't some well-known author, he was just doing this in his spare time. But his grasp on words, his use of literary devices, and his use of synesthesia, so many different techniques, is astounding to me. And that alone might just be able to convince you to read 200 pages of a man rambling about birds. But that's not all. So nature writing is often a very passive form of writing. But Baker is able to incorporate metaphors into it. He's able to incorporate important imagery, important messages, and most interestingly, there's a very distinct narrative arc going on. So I mentioned that Baker spent 10 years of his life working on this, and throughout the course of the book you can see how this casual interest in these birds slowly turns into an obsession, to the point where towards the end there's passages where Baker is talking about these birds in a way where it seems like he relates more to them than he does to other people. And it's really interesting the way he does that. There's a passage towards the end which I really liked, where he talks about how the way that peregrine falcons kill their victims, because these are apex predators, these are birds of prey, and he's able to describe the way that they kill other animals in a sense where there's some beauty to it. But in contrast, the way that men kill other men, or the way that men kill other animals, there's malicious intent behind it. It's not beautiful anymore, it's corrupt, it's disgusting, it's vile, and it's one of the things which makes man the cruelest animal. And he definitely has some sort of a point there. There's definitely themes of conservationism, themes of anti-industrialization interweaved between the beautiful prose of The Peregrine. But I think there's one more reason why this book is such an important read in today's day and age. Because we're so consumed by, instant entertainment, Netflix, social media, constantly getting notifications, a constant stream of information, a constant stream of entertainment, that it's sometimes a good idea to sit back, to relax, and to read about a time where someone could spend 10 whole years of their lives, a full decade, just doing one thing. I think this idea of careful and diligent observation is perfectly summed up by this really beautiful line from the book. Baker says, "The hardest thing of all to see is often what is really there." Right, so unfortunately, the next book on the list isn't nearly as good. It was the Presocratics Reader by Patricia Kurt. The problem with this book isn't that I don't agree with the Presocratics or I have some sort of beef with the Presocratics. I'll actually talk about my views on the Presocratics in a minute. But the problem with the book in terms of its structure is that so the book is 15 chapters, right? And each chapter either talks about one specific philosopher or one specific school of philosophy. But if let's say a chapter is 20 pages, then there's like a 2-page introduction at the start, and then there's like 18 pages of these very obscure fragments, most of which don't even make sense out of context, because these are all out of context. You don't really understand where the philosopher is coming from, where the writer is coming from. You just know that these are some of the very few fragments that we have of their original writings. In fact, the 2-page introduction at the start of each chapter is probably what provides the most information. It's where you can actually get a cohesive and an understandable account of these philosophers, their ideologies, their influences, and their histories. So in terms of the structure, this book could have either been 10 times shorter, where we just have those introductions and we get as equally clear of an idea of what the philosophers were all about. Or this book could have been 10 times as long, where with each fragment that is added, there's at least a little portion at the end where they talk about what this fragment means, what the context is, what the implications are. So at least there's some point to having these very obscure fragmented texts within the book. Now moving on, what my views on the Presocratics are, especially after reading this book, right? So the fact that these Presocratics were the ones which were influencing, the likes of Socrates and Plato, shows that there's definitely a lot of worth to what they were saying. But considering the fact that we have very little evidence of their actual writings, it's really hard to get a true grasp of what their ideas really were. That paired with the fact that some of their ideas were just, sort of dumb, considering that science and technology and astrology have all moved on so much, they've all advanced so much that a lot of those ideas don't really make a lot of sense anymore. But again, very influential, very important to read them if you're into philosophy, but this might not just be the best book for it. Alright, so the next book on the list is Stamped from the Beginning by Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. And I think that this is one of the most well-researched works of nonfiction that I've ever read. The book is supposed to explain the entire history of racism in America, but I think it sort of is underselling itself. The book doesn't only start with the Declaration of Independence, it starts well before that. It starts from the time of Columbus and it goes all the way up till present date, where it talks about police brutality and mass incarceration. And in doing so, it doesn't just discuss racism. It talks about sexism, it talks about classism, it talks about homophobia, transphobia, ethnocentrism, and it links all of these with the history of racism in America. And in doing so, you realize how much the history of racism, sexism, ethnocentrism, transphobia, homophobia, classism are essentially the same thing as the history of America. These ideas are so ingrained within its very fabric that they are essentially indispensable, and they've always existed, they continue to exist, and for a very long time they will continue to exist until or unless there's some actual change. Now interestingly, the book is told through the eyes of 5 narrators. It starts from Cotton Mather, then it's Thomas Jefferson, followed by William Lloyd Garrison, W.E.B. Du Bois, and finally, when it's talking about the present date, it's told through the eyes of Angela Davis. And throughout this history, it talks about pretty much every single personality, pretty much every single event, pretty much every single theory in race studies that you might have heard of, and even a lot which you probably have never heard of, or you probably heard of but you didn't realize the implications of. And I think one of my most favorite parts about the book is how it explains so many events in American history which were seemingly anti-racist, but they really weren't. For example, just off the top of my head, when it talks about how Lincoln abolished slavery, it discusses how that wasn't really a humanitarian move as much as it was a political one. Lincoln wasn't initially an abolitionist. He became an abolitionist because it was in his political interest. It's a very dense book, but it's a very, very important read, and I definitely recommend that if you're interested in the history of America, or if you're interested in the history of racism or the history of colonialism in general, I definitely recommend that you check this book out. Alright, so the next book on the list is Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. Now, there's a reason why I'm holding this book right now, because so my friends know this, and I think, if any of my friends are watching this, they're probably going to be rolling their eyes right now, because I've told them this story countless times. Watchmen is a book which I've wanted to read for the past 5 years, and I have looked everywhere. It's not available in Pakistan for some reason. There's not much of a demand for it, so obviously there's not much of a supply either. And finally I realized I don't think I'm gonna find it here, so I ordered it online, and it finally came a month ago, and I read it sometime this month. And obviously, if you wait 5 years to read a book, you have some insanely high expectations for it, and I'm really, really happy to say that Watchmen didn't just meet those expectations, it still managed to exceed them. I think I might do like a full breakdown of the Watchmen comic series in a later video, but right now I just think I'd like to point out some of the coolest parts about it and some of the things which make it one of the best comic books ever made. Now, firstly, I think that Alan Moore is a master in storytelling, because the story in Watchmen is firstly not linear. There's often, flashbacks to the past, and then they're interweaved with the present. And if done poorly, this could have been very confusing. That, paired with the fact that there's so many different characters, each with their very distinct, very personal, very complex stories, means that this book could have easily been a train wreck. But it isn't. It's one of the most cohesive, one of the most exciting reads I've ever read, and that's because Moore is able to bring in all of these different strands of stories and combine them into an experience which is just amazing. It's hard to describe it, it's just something which you have to experience for your own self. The comics also have a ton of literary merit. There's a critique of binary opposition, which is often seen in modern literature, right? There's these good guys and there's these bad guys. It's also brimming with this meta-narrative on comic books. Watchmen is effectively a comic book about comic books. And there's also this very interesting philosophical moral debate going on. There's this idea of whether or not it's important to always be good, or is it more important to be utilitarian and to consider the fact that a little bit of harm at times is important for the greater good. And moving on, the design of these comic books is also a marvel. No pun intended. These comics are genuinely designed so meticulously that they make full use of the comic book genre, and that's why I think it was Captain Christian who did an amazing video on why a film adaptation of Watchmen can never live up to the real comic books, because these comic books don't attempt to distance themselves from comic books. They attempt to utilize their maximum potential. Just like one example is chapter 5, Fateful Symmetry. The chapter is basically mirrored end to end. So the first and last page, the second and second last page are mirrors of each other. And right when you reach the middle is the part where Ozymandias thwarts his own assassination attempt. Similarly, chapter 12, right? The whole comic book, though it does have violence, it's never gratuitous until you reach chapter 12, which is the destruction of New York. So in the final chapter is the first time that you actually see, a bunch of dead bodies, you see death, you see destruction, and that whole subdued sort of violence builds up to this one very impactful moment. It's just often, these very subtle things like that example of chapter 5, or these very loud and very in-your-face things like that example of chapter 5, which just show how well designed and how well crafted these comics are, and how well Gibbons and Moore were able to work together. I guess if I had any sort of complaint with the comic books, and this is rather nitpicky, is the fact that each chapter ends with these 2 to 4 page documentations, which can range from newspaper clippings to excerpts from one of the superheroes' autobiographies. And what the issue is that these sometimes tend to slow the pace down. You'll end the main chapter with some really interesting moment, and then you have like these 4 pages of just walls of text, but they do add a lot to the characters, so I can't really complain much. But overall, Watchmen was an amazing experience. It is one of the most exciting reads I've had in a long time. I think I'm using the word most exciting, most well-researched, most interesting a lot in this video, and that's maybe because I've read a lot of really good books this month. Alright, so the next book on the list is actually a collection of Socratic dialogues, and that is Plato's Last Days of Socrates. Now this collection includes Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, and Phaedo. These are supposed to chronicle essentially the last days of Socrates, but it starts with Euthyphro, which takes place right before Socrates appears in court. Then it's preceded by the Apology, which is Socrates' defense in court after that, when he's convicted of corrupting the youth and blaspheming. We move on to Crito, and Crito is basically about a moral dilemma of whether or not it's ethical to escape prison. And last but not the least is Phaedo, which takes place during the last hours of Socrates' life, where he has a conversation with his friends and students, and then he drinks the hemlock and dies. Let's talk about each of these dialogues one by one, right? So let's start with Euthyphro, because obviously it's the one which comes first, right? So the main subject of Euthyphro is piety, and I think the crown jewel of the whole dialogue is the famous Euthyphro dilemma, that is piety because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is piety? This whole Euthyphro dilemma has had a lot of important implications, in terms of theology, in terms of especially the divine command theory. It was overall a really interesting dialogue. If you're interested in, the crossroads of philosophy and theology, you would particularly love this dialogue. Next up is the Apology. The Apology, as I mentioned, is Socrates in court. This is a dialogue more based in rhetoric, and this is one of the dialogues which people who are new to philosophy, and especially new to Plato's works, are probably going to read as one of their first dialogues. Socrates attempts to defend himself. He talks about what a proper punishment for him would be. He discusses his own crime and how his crime wasn't really corrupting the youth. In fact, he argues very much against that. He argues how he's actually helping the youth in a way that the rest of society isn't. And this is the dialogue where I think one of my favorite aspects of the Platonic or the Socratic works come from, which is the famous Socratic paradox, that I know nothing, where Socrates argues that he's the same as all of these other people because nobody really knows nothing, but at least Socrates is self-aware about that. So overall, it's a very simple dialogue. It's very straightforward, a really good introduction to the Socratic works. Following this is Crito. Now Crito is a dialogue which firstly is very different from most of the Socratic dialogues, in the sense that it's, from what I remember, it's the only Socratic dialogue out of all of Plato's works which has a practical moral dilemma in it. But overall, I didn't really like Crito, and the reason for that is it's a really short dialogue, and personally I just felt that the reasoning in it just didn't feel as well grounded to me. They felt rather vague. I didn't enjoy it as much, but considering the fact that it's this short, it wasn't really too much of an annoyance. Lastly is Phaedo, which just might be my favorite Socratic dialogue after the Republic, of course. Phaedo is also the longest dialogue in this book, and it is amazing. It's a multi-layered work where the main focus is basically on the soul and how to argue that the soul is immortal. And there's also some really interesting refutations to the idea that the soul is immortal, and the reasoning here is also really, really interesting. I would recommend that you check this book out, especially if you're interested in these kinds of topics, about the soul, about life after death, about the circle of life. And I mentioned that this dialogue is multi-layered, right? Because in between these discussions of the soul, there's also a whole passage where Socrates sort of, in an autobiographical sense, describes his own learning process, his own growth as a philosopher. And at the end, there's this beautiful passage about Plato's idea of the Isle of the Blessed. He talks about this higher plane of existence with a beautiful prose, a beautiful description. And overall, this is not just a really intriguing Socratic dialogue, but also a beautifully written one. And overall, I enjoyed the book. I do think, most of the dialogues are rather simplistic, but as an introduction to Socrates and Plato, these might just be a really, really helpful one. Alright, so now we're at the final book, and I think I'll actually keep this one really brief because I'm still reading the book, and that is Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. Now, I'll explain the story a bit. I won't get into spoilers. I'll just explain the premise of the story. It's basically about this guy named Alfonso Quixote. Mostly throughout the book, he's referred to Don Quixote. And the premise is that this guy gets really, really engrossed by books on chivalry. You know, he just falls in love with them. He's obsessed by them. And he's a hidalgo, right? So he's an idle nobleman. And he spends his days and nights reading these books until he goes mad. And when he does so, he starts to imagine that he himself is one of those knights in shining armor, and he has to, you know, defend the kingdom for his princess or whatever, right? And so he embarks on these adventures with his trusty squire, who's actually his neighbor, Sancho Panza. And the both of them, you know, they just like travel the land and they get into all sorts of trouble. And there's this really famous passage. It's in the initial chapters, right, which perfectly highlight the idealism of Don Quixote compared to the realism of Sancho Panza, where Don Quixote sees these bunch of windmills and he imagines them to be giants, and he's like, you know, as a knight, it's my duty to fight these wild beasts. And you know, he goes up to them, he charges with his lance, and you know, his lance gets stuck in one of the windmill's arms, and he ends up hurting himself. And the whole time Sancho Panza is shouting at him that, no man, these aren't giants, these are windmills. And that's, you know, that's one of the most famous parts of the book. You know, it sort of perfectly highlights the dynamic between Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. And throughout the story, so far, again, as I mentioned, you know, I'm only like 20% through it. You can still see how, you know, there's going to be a lot of character development. These two are going to develop a really deep bond, and you know, I'm really excited to see where the story leads me. It's a wonderful book so far, and I'm really looking forward to telling you guys all about it in probably next month's video or in a later video if I intend to fully review this book. But yeah, I think that's about it. These are the 6 books that I've read or I'm currently reading this month. Let me know what books you guys are reading these days, or you know, if you have any takes on the books that I've mentioned, let me know about that too. You know, let's start a discussion in the comment section. Other than that, you know, if you enjoyed the video, a like or a subscribe would be really, really helpful. But yeah, you know, as always, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you guys in the next one.